Hey everybody, welcome back. In this podcast, we're going to actually do a crossover episode and hear from Dr. Jeff Jarvis as he explores the new research out called the PREOXI Trial. You've probably seen this on social media or maybe heard this on other podcast episodes. I think he does an excellent job breaking down the research and really looking at this from the application standpoint. So enjoy.
So y'all might have heard that I am passionate about making EMS intubation safer. I've spent a lot of time developing a bundle of care based on the best evidence available to decrease rates of peri-intubation hypoxia, hypotension, and cardiac arrest while increasing first-pass success. I've implemented a DSI-based protocol at 3 different systems now aimed at doing this. The key part of these protocols is using ketamine to relax the patient and allow us to implement evidence-based pre-oxygenation strategies, thus optimizing the patient's physiology in preparation for a short period of apnea, hopefully short, to allow for intubation. Now, that pre-oxygenation is the important thing. I require non-invasive ventilation using either CPAP or BiPAP or manual for at least 3 minutes in these protocols. Now, this was based on several trials in healthy patients comparing non-invasive ventilation to face mask for pre-oxygenation, and that showed better pre-oxygenation with non-invasive ventilation. Because of that, I mandated non-invasive ventilation across the board. Now, despite this evidence, there's been ongoing debate about the need for non-invasive ventilation. There are some people that still advocate for using pre-oxygenation only with a non-rebreather, particularly in patients that aren't hypoxic. So the way this argument goes is, well, they're not hypoxic now. Non-rebreather is just fine. So in order to answer this question, what we really needed was an RCT of patients undergoing intubation when they're sick, and including quite a few patients who weren't hypoxic to begin with, so that we would best understand the appropriate methods. Well, we've got a paper just like that. The PREOXI Trial was just published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and it's getting a lot of attention, and rightly so. Stick around and we'll dig into the details.
What is a lighthouse? It is a tower with a bright light at the top, located at an important or dangerous place. The main purpose of a lighthouse is to serve as a navigational aid and to warn of dangerous areas. Welcome to the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast, illuminating the darkness of current EMS clinical practice with the bright light of science. Here's your host, Dr. Jeff Jarvis.
Howdy, y'all. I'm Dr. Jeff Jarvis, back with another episode of the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast, where we bring the bright light of science to the darkness of current EMS clinical practice. Y'all, I am really excited about today's episode because it is a well-done RCT that can inform one of the key aspects of safer intubation, that is pre-oxygenation. So why do I care so much about this? Well, because I have been in charge of systems that ended up hurting people when we're trying to help people. I lost a lot of sleep trying to make sure that those episodes never happened again. Now, if you haven't heard me talk about this before, the short story is I was very focused on improving intubation first-pass success at my prior system. We went through multiple PDSA cycles, working hard to focus on our use of the King Vision video laryngoscope. Now, I'm not using that device anymore at my new system, but that's a story for a whole different podcast. I got our system so focused on first-pass success that we lost sight of the more important thing. That is what was happening to our patients as we performed intubation. We had a sentinel event where we had a prolonged intubation attempt that precipitated profound hypoxia and led to Brady asystolic cardiac arrest from the hypoxia. Now, as part of the investigation into that event, and knowing that my focus on first pass success was way more to blame than the medics performing the intubation, we discovered a couple things. The biggest of which is that 45% of our RSI intubations resulted in peri-intubation hypoxia. I felt like that was unacceptable, and I did what I normally do when trying to solve a problem. I dove into the literature. Why? Well, because I'm a nerd, that's why. I can hear you asking, don't judge. I'm a nerd, you know it. That's what I do. Well, what did I find? I found quite a few things, ranging from best position to undergo intubation in, best position to pre-oxygenate with, whether we should use apneic oxygenation or not, and whether we should be doing non-invasive ventilation compared to just mask ventilation. So the protocol we ended up with was based on mandatory delayed sequence intubation for all non-cardiac arrest intubations. The protocol was a bundle of care that included the following components. Again, number one, universal DSI using ketamine to allow proper preparation. 2, head-up positioning during pre-oxygenation and intubation. Step 3 was apneic oxygenation used at flush rates throughout pre-ox and intubation. 4 was pre-ox using a BVM with PEEP or BiPAP. 5 was mandatory goal-directed physiologic targets. Now, what this means is that there will be no intubation without continuous SpO2 readings of 94% or better for at least 3 minutes and an SBP, systolic blood pressure, greater than 100. If you can't hit those targets, at least in my systems, you're going to bail out and use a supraglottic. At any point in here, if the SpO2 drops below 94%, you punch out, correct the problem, get it up above 94, and keep it there for 3 minutes. You got to have 3 minutes or you don't attempt the intubation. So that's the bundle of care that we've implemented, 3 different systems now. So we published the results of this bundle, and we did it in a before and after study, published it in Annals of Emergency Medicine. And the bottom line is we saw a decrease in peri-intubation hypoxia from 45% to 3.5%. It worked. It worked there. It worked at other systems. Now, one of the key components of our DSI protocol is giving ketamine to allow maximum pre-oxygenation. So what's the best approach to pre-ox? Well, there are several papers showing better pre-oxygenation in a head-up position and better pre-ox with non-invasive ventilation than non-rebreather. Unfortunately, the evidence is not all showing the same thing. It's a bit mixed. There are some papers showing better pre-ox with non-rebreather, particularly in patients that are not hypoxic. Now, that evidence is also a bit weak because it's typically in healthy patients undergoing routine anesthesia, not really the patients we're intubating. And again, there is this feeling of equipoise out there in the world. There's resistance to using non-invasive ventilation for pre-ox, certainly across the board. And that's where the PREOXI trial comes in. And it's why I'm so excited about it. I've been waiting for a trial like this for a long time. It provides direct, high-quality evidence about this question and in critical patients, the sort of patients we intubate in the field and we intubate in the ER. Now, with that out of the way, let's jump into this paper. So the title of this paper is Non-Invasive Ventilation for Pre-Oxygenation During Emergency Intubation. There were a crap ton of authors, but the lead author was Dr. K.W. Gibbs, writing for the larger group of investigators. It was published online in the New England Journal of Medicine, June 13th, 2024. Seriously hot off the presses, considering I am recording this episode on the 16th. Speaking of which, happy Father's Day out there to all of my fellow fathers. I hope y'all are celebrating having the greatest job in the world with your family. I know we're going outside later on in the scalding hot Texas weather. We're watching some Astros baseball. Now, the methods of this study, it was a pragmatic, multi-center, non-blinded, randomized control trial. It was conducted in 7 emergency departments and 17 ICUs at 15 different medical centers in the United States. Pragmatic here means that only the methods of pre-oxygenation was specified in the protocol, and everything else was done according to local standards and clinician judgment. That does help us extrapolate this and generalize it to other settings better. The population. These were critically ill adults 18 and over who were undergoing intubation using sedation and laryngoscopy, RSI. They excluded the usual suspects, prisoners, pregnant women, pediatrics, those hard-to-study P population patients. They also excluded patients who, in the opinion of the treating clinician, could not tolerate a 3-minute period of pre-oxygenation by any method. In other words, the dreaded crash intubations. Now, I've discussed my suspicion of this concept of crash intubations in a previous episode, and I might have let slip my belief that almost all patients can wait 3 minutes and they will benefit from it. But again, that's a different episode. Now, the authors also excluded patients that the attending physician felt either required or wouldn't tolerate either of the methods of pre-ox being studied here. In other words, if they felt they absolutely positively had to have non-invasive ventilation, they were excluded from the trial. Now, finally, they excluded patients who were already on non-invasive ventilation before randomization. And remember, randomization occurred before any sedative was given. The intervention that they're looking at here, it was 3 minutes of pre-ox using a non-invasive ventilation. And they define that as a tight-fitting mask and ventilator or a dedicated bilevel machine. All patients had 100% FiO2 and at least 5 of expiratory support and 10 of inspiratory support. Now, the control group was also 3 minutes of pre-ox, but they got it with a mask without PEEP or pressure support. The trial would have allowed a non-rebreather, which was, by the way, used in the vast majority of patients. It would have also allowed a simple mask or even a BVM if they weren't using PEEP and they weren't on a ventilator. Now, I mentioned the vast majority were on a non-rebreather. It turns out to be around 88%. The difference was in simple mask, it looks like. Now, whatever type mask was used, it was attached to flush rate oxygen at least 15 liters or higher, whatever it would go to. Now, both groups could get apneic oxygenation at the discretion of the attending physician, and the operators could use either direct laryngoscopy or video laryngoscopy, depending on what they wanted to. That's not what was being studied here. Outcomes. The primary outcome was the proportion of patients with peri-intubation hypoxemia. That's defined as an SpO2 of under 85%. And the time period. What does peri-intubation mean? Well, it was defined as between the time the sedation was given and 2 minutes after intubation. Now, I got to point something out here. This interval from sedation to 2 minutes after intubation, that is a shorter interval than the NIMSQA Airway 01 measure, also known as -1A. It looks at 5 minutes before to 5 minutes after intubation. Now, in all fairness, the NIMSQA measure committee has approved a change to this to go to 3 minutes before and 5 minutes after. We did that as part of our ongoing measure maintenance work. That's just an aside. I got to plug the NIMSQA measures, got to wear my NIMSQA hat here. But that aside, just to be clear, the peri-intubation interval in this paper was from the time of sedation to 2 minutes after intubation. All right, secondary outcomes. Well, it was the lowest SpO2 recorded during the peri-intubation period. It was measured as a continuous variable, as opposed to the primary, which was dichotomous. It was either hypoxemic or not. Now, they also had a bunch of exploratory outcomes. They looked at 2 levels of hypoxemia, under 80 and again under 70%. They looked at hypotension, which they defined as the systolic blood pressure under 65. Yeah, I think that counts as hypotensive. They also looked at the rates of cardiac arrest, first pass success, operator witnessed aspiration during the intubation, the development of new infiltrates on chest x-ray 24 hours after intubation. A lot of exploratory variables. Now, the analysis was pretty straightforward, just like you would expect in a randomized trial. Complicated statistics are typically done in observational studies because they're trying to compensate for uncontrolled biases, uncontrolled variables. But that's the beauty of a randomized trial. All confounders, including those that are known and unknown, are controlled for. Why? Well, because they should appear equally in both groups. That's what randomization does. There's no need for complicated propensity matching or regression. Not that there's anything wrong with these. It's just that they're typically not needed because of randomization, assuming randomization doesn't just completely fail. Because it's random, it is possible it will fail, and that's why you'll always have a table of one comparing the base, or a table one comparing the baseline characteristics between groups. Now, I mention this because the primary and secondary outcomes in this paper are reported as an unadjusted difference. What was the difference in the rate of occurrence? Now, they also threw in 95% confidence intervals. They used a chi-square test with intention to treat analysis for the primary outcome. The intention to treat part means that patients were analyzed in the group to which they were assigned, regardless of the treatment they actually got. That's typically the recommended method of analysis for RCTs. Now, most importantly, these were obviously smart researchers. How do I know that? Well, because they used R. They didn't use some inferior product like, say, Stata, despite the fact that Stata is based in College Station, home of my beloved Texas Aggies. Despite that, still inferior programming language. Now, I say this really just as a test. I'm trying to see whether Rimley ever listens to this podcast. If she does, that'll definitely get her attention. All right, that's the methods. Let's get to these juicy results. They determined they needed to recruit a sample size of 1,264 patients, and they were looking for a 6% difference between hypoxemia between these two groups. They ended up with 1,301 patients, and they enrolled them between March of 22 and October 23, hopefully after the major impact of COVID. Now, there were 645 patients in the non-invasive ventilation group and 656 in the mask group. What did their consort table look like? Who did they include? Who did they exclude? Well, to get the 1,300, they assessed over 4,500 patients for eligibility, and they excluded around 3,000, a little over 3,000. Now, of these, almost a third were excluded because the operator felt this was a crash airway. In other words, we had to intubate them too urgently to allow for proper pre-oxygenation. Now, again, I'm kind of scoffing at this, but that's what happened. I really wish they had reported the rates of hypoxemia in this excluded group, but if they did, I can't find it anywhere. It obviously wouldn't have had an impact on the non-invasive versus mask ventilation because they never got randomized. But I just have this feeling that when we say it's a crash airway, bad things happen more than if in that same population we'd taken our time and done it right. As a matter of fact, April and his colleagues reported that there was an 80% increase in the odds of peri-intubation cardiac arrest for these crash airways. This is a critical population that we really need to think long and hard about how we manage. Now, as we would expect from a randomized control trial, baseline characteristics were similar between the two groups. RCTs work. Median age, 61, 40% were female. Roughly 75% of the intubations were performed in the ICU, with the remaining 25-ish done in the emergency department. The median SpO2 low point in the hour before intubation was 95%. In other words, this was a group with an awful lot of patients who were sick but not hypoxic. Now, I think it's important because of the not entirely unreasonable arguments of not requiring NIV Preox in patients without hypoxia. Now, I don't like it, and I don't allow it, and I don't do it in my practice, but I was having, up until this paper, a hard time saying even in that population you should use NIV. Now, over 95% of all patients received at least 3 minutes of Preox, so they did what the trial asked them to do. And about 90% were not hypoxic before induction of anesthesia. So not only were they not hypoxic before they were randomized, whatever type of pre-oxygen they were getting relieved the hypoxemia in over 90%. Over 98% of patients in both groups got both sedation and paralysis. So, in other words, this was RSI. Now, I read the supplemental tables so you wouldn't have to, and what I found is 75% of patients, because I hear you asking, what kind of drugs did they give? Don't worry, I'm going to tell you. 75% of patients got etomidate, about 20% got ketamine, the remainder got some version of either opioids or benzos, or opioids and benzos, or propofol. 85-ish% got rocuronium, and about 15% got SUX. Who did the intubations? Well, fellows did about 55% of the intubations, with residents doing about 32%, and attendings picking up around 6%. Physician specialties reflect where these intubations occurred. As we would expect, a fellow doing that is most likely to be doing the intubation in the ICU, and most intubations were done there. So 67% of the specialties were critical care. That's likely who the fellows were. About 30% were emergency medicine, with about 2% in both groups being intubated by anesthesia. What type of laryngoscope did they use? 83% of the time they were using VL, 22% using a bougie on first attempt. First pass success using the novel definition of one laryngoscopy attempt and one bougie or tube attempt was 83% in non-invasive and 82% in the mask group. So basically the same, low 80s. Using the standard definition of just one laryngoscopy attempt, regardless of the number of attempts to pass the bougie or the tube, was a little bit higher, as we would expect, 89% and 87% respectively. Now, if you're interested in learning more about this definition thing, I covered a paper by Trent and colleagues that really described it in more detail in episode 74. Go back, take a listen to that if you want to know. Now, there wasn't a whole lot of apneic oxygenation going on, but there was a difference between the groups. 3% had apneic ox in the non-invasive group, and 16% had it in the mask group. I think this difference is worth talking about. Now, prior work, including a systematic review by Pavlov and Weingart, showed apneic oxygenation reduces peri-intubation hypoxemia. We would therefore expect, if there was truly no difference in hypoxia based on your pre-ox strategy, for there to be less hypoxemia in the face mask group, because almost 5 times as many patients in this group got apneic oxygenation. So just keep that in mind. This difference biases the result in favor of pre-oxygenation with face masks. So if we end up seeing less hypoxemia with non-invasive ventilation, it is despite this difference, and it would strengthen our confidence in the results. All right, that's it for baseline characteristics. Now on to the main course. There was less peri-intubation hypoxemia in the non-invasive ventilation group compared with the mask group. Wasn't really close. In fact, it was almost twice as much. The specific numbers, 9.1% in the non-invasive group versus 18.5% in the mask group. That's an absolute difference of 9.4% favoring non-invasive ventilation. Confidence interval goes from 5.6 to 13.2. Now, I mentioned a sensitivity analysis. In that, they calculated an adjusted risk difference after controlling for all the expected confounders, except, interestingly, apneic oxygenation, and they found similar results. So SpO2 nadir, the low point, it also favored non-invasive ventilation. The median low SpO2 is 99% in non-invasive and 97% in the mask group. Now, that was statistically significant, even if it doesn't seem like that big of a difference, 99 to 97. But remember that the median they're reporting, the median is a statistic that minimizes the impact of large outliers. So just keep that in mind. A little nerd point for you. They included a severity of hypoxemia outcome. What they found, 6.2% of patients in the non-invasive group had a low SpO2 under 80% compared to 13.2% with the mask. Likewise, 2.4% in the NIV group had a low under 70 compared to 5.7% in the mask group. Both of those are significant. There was also less peri-intubation cardiac arrest, thankfully low in both groups, but 0.02 in NIV and 1.1 with mask. There was no difference in peri-intubation hypotension, first pass success, or aspiration. So those are the results. Bottom line is this is a well-designed RCT of critically ill patients undergoing intubation, and it confirms that we should be pre-oxygenating these patients with non-invasive ventilation, basically using BiPAP or the poor man's CPAP, BVM with apneic oxygenation and PEEP. So what's my takeaway? NRB for pre-oxygenation, just say no. Seriously, stop doing it. Now, some of you are out there. I can hear you, I can hear what you're saying. You're saying still we need to do NIV in hypoxic patients. We'll spot you that. But if there aren't hypoxic, a mask, it's just fine. Except that's not what this trial showed. Remember, the vast majority of patients in this trial were not hypoxic before induction. Despite that, non-invasive ventilation was better and had less peri-intubation hypoxemia. But, I can still hear you saying, but NIV, it's a pain in the ass to set up. Yeah, and? Well, it turns out so is pre-oxygenation. I don't care. This is about our patients. It's not about us and our convenience. I've said many times, if we're going to intubate, we need to do it right. And if we can't do it right, we shouldn't do it at all. If we can't be bothered to adequately prepare our patients for a safe intubation, then we shouldn't intubate them. We should just use a supraglottic instead. Remember, it's about our patients. It's not about our egos. We need to do it right. And now we have even more evidence that doing it right means using non-invasive ventilation for pre-oxygenation. As with any paper, it's important to look at what the paper cannot tell us. This paper looked only at the approach to pre-oxygenation. Pre-ox is clearly important, but it's only one component of adequate preparation. I am still 100% on board with universal DSI. I think this paper supports the bundle that we've built, even if this paper is only addressing one part of the bundle. Now, don't worry, there's lots of evidence for other parts of the bundle too. Feel free to read my paper in Annals about it, or I wrote an article in EMS magazine that went through the evidence for all of the components. Now, we just have stronger evidence for this one part of the bundle. Guys, as always, I welcome your comments or questions. I'm really excited about this paper. I think it is meaningful because it strengthens what I, anyway, felt like we already knew, and I always like papers that do that. You can reach me on Twitter or X or whatever it's called at Dr. Jeff Jarvis. Thanks for what y'all do every day to take care of your communities. And thanks for listening. Take care, y'all.
You've been listening to the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast, a proud member of the FlightBridge Ed podcast family and a Fire Dog production. Visit flightbridgeed.com for more information.